Hi, I'm Zach Singerman, and welcome to the Gen Z Jews Speaker Series. In this series, I'll be interviewing national leaders on the topics of anti-Semitism, Israel, and leadership. Today, my guest is Rabbi Abraham Cooper, the Associate Dean, Director of Global Social Action Agenda of the Simon Wiesenthal Center. He has had an esteemed career and is considered one of the most influential rabbis in the United States. So, Rabbi Cooper, thank you so much for coming on today.
It's good to see you again, Zach, and it's always good to connect with one of the up-and-coming younger leaders in the Jewish community. It makes old guys like me feel more confident about our future.
Thank you. So, for teens who may not be familiar with the Simon Wiesenthal Center, can you provide a snapshot of the important work you do?
Sure. First of all, the name, Simon Wiesenthal, was known as the great Nazi hunter after World War II. He was actually an architect before the Second World War in Eastern Europe, married his childhood sweetheart, and as for the millions and millions of other European Jews, when World War II broke out, their lives were going to be shattered and in many cases lost. By the end of the Second World War, Mr. Wiesenthal and his wife had lost 89 members of their family to the Nazis, virtually everyone. And when he was actually liberated by the United States Army in May 1945, when they came upon the Mauthausen concentration camp, the last of 6 places he was. On May 3rd, 1945, a couple of days later, World War II was over. He was so weak that he couldn't stand to greet the American soldiers. So probably another week, he probably would have starved to death. But even in that weakened state, he started almost in the beginning of wanting to bring the criminals who mass murdered his mother, family, and 6 million other Jews, to try to bring them before the bar of justice. He wasn't trained as an investigator. He wasn't a lawyer. But he eventually became, if you will, the unofficial ambassador of 6 million ghosts. And over the decades brought 1,100 Nazi war criminals before the bar of justice,
Wow.
Which was quite amazing. He had something to do in the Eichmann case and many of the other high-profile mass murderers. And he also tracked down and exposed the, turned out, Viennese police officer after World War II, who had actually arrested Anne Frank and her family. So he was an amazing man. I got to know and work with him for 29 years. And my boss and mentor, partner, senior partner, Rabbi Marvin Heyer, who founded the Simon Wiesenthal Center, went to Vienna, Austria, back in 1976, invoked King Solomon, who said, a good name is more precious than oil. And he told Mr. Wiesenthal, I'm here to take your good name. And he said, well, wait a second. If you're just going to build a museum where people can come twice a year to say Kaddish for their department, that's a beautiful thing. I'll give you a letter. But if you want my name, I'm an activist. And if you're prepared to be an activist institution as well as a teaching institution, you can have my name. I came with Rabbi Heyer in 1977 to begin the Simon Wiesenthal Center. I grew up in what was then known as the Soviet Jewry movement, a lot of it run by students. And I was an activist in that area for many, many years. And so for me, it was kind of like a perfect shidduch, as they say, someone who was involved already as a young Jewish activist, having the opportunity to mentor under such an amazing man. So obviously, teaching about the Holocaust, we've done exhibitions. We have a traveling exhibition that's gone all over the world called Courage to Remember. Our film division, Mariah Films, which produces documentaries about the Holocaust and about Israel. Rabbi Heyer has 2 Academy Awards. We have 2 Oscars. We have a whole film division. Wow. The Museum of Tolerance, that obviously a good half of that museum is devoted to the study, the memory, and the lessons of the Holocaust. And the other part of our involvement has to do with issues of the day. So BDS, anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial. I have a piece in this morning's Newsweek, if you want to take a look at it later, Zachary.
Oh, definitely.
That gives an outline of our involvement with Gulf states and other Arab and Muslim countries to try to bring about, peaceful coexistence. And what just happened between the UAE and Israel, we play a small independent role because, after all, what are we teaching? We're not business people. We're not looking for a business deal. We want people to show mutual, respect, and we'd like for traditional enemies to step away from the hatred. And that, I think, is a kind of overarching commitment that we've made, and that means that my involvement also extends to human rights in North Korea, to the situation of the Uyghurs in China. There's no shortage of issues that we are also involved with, but first and foremost, without apologies, we want to defend our fellow Jews around the world. One other area that I know is of great interest, not only interest, it's sort of like part of your DNA, your generation's DNA, is 27 years ago I began a project here called Digital Terrorism and Hate. So we've been monitoring and trying to fight the abuse and the leveraging of internet technologies by extremists, not just anti-Semites, people who hate blacks, people who are for terrorists. And we're right now involved in a series of discussions, for example, with Facebook. So that's an issue that's not just about Jews in terms of fighting hate in social media. When Asian Americans were targeted during the virus pandemic, we spoke out against that. Obviously, there are always going to be anti-Semites who are going to blame the Jews for everything. We started the virus, and then us clever Jews in Israel were going to come up with a vaccine so we can make billions of dollars, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And I'd like you to remember a quote from someone who passed away way before you were born. His name was Winston Churchill, famous British leader who helped defeat Adolf Hitler and the Nazis in World War II. An amazing, amazing man. He lived also deep into his 90s, but he said something about 100 years ago. He said that a lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth gets its pants on. And now when we're living in the world where social media is instantaneous, then obviously there's tremendous focus on that's really the front line of the battlefield across the board.
Mm-hmm. And so, at the center, what's your job?
This is a good question. A lot of people ask me that now for the last 43 years, maybe even members of my own family. I'm a troublemaker, and I try to also, with the help of my colleagues, be a little bit of a trailblazer. What we learned from the Holocaust is that we're not very good at predicting things. So I help to coordinate our response both to local, national, and international affairs with my colleagues who are based in Jerusalem, in Paris, in Buenos Aires, and hundreds of thousands of members all over the world who are often communicating with us and telling us about a difficult situation. So my job is sometimes to be an arsonist, start a fire because no one seems to be paying attention, and sometimes being a firefighter trying to douse the flames. So I have a lot of flexibility that way, and of course, with the help of my amazingly committed and talented colleagues, we're able to impact on issues. So to give you just one recent example, there's a party called the Democratic Socialist Party. It's basically a communist party, but they rebranded themselves, based out of New York. They have now circulated a questionnaire to any candidate who wants to run under their ticket for the City Council of New York in 2021. And they ask two things. One, they want a commitment that if they win, they will never travel to Israel. And two, wanting to know whether or not they support BDS, and if they don't, why don't they? Now, that's about as anti-Semitic as an outrageous you can get. Uh-huh. But one of the things that we did is we set out a tweet and then an e-blast and approached a lot of the elected officials in the New York area, asking them to make their own public declarations. And I see, just before I came on with you, that New York Mayor de Blasio criticized them, blasted them. So that would be an example of something coming up where you really need to have a quick response. Not that you're, quote unquote, taking care of the issue, but you want to make sure that the issue is understood by the largest number of people and hopefully get others to get involved. You probably know recently my interaction with a guy by the name of Nick Cannon, who had a podcast, and one of our researchers saw it and said, you have to watch this. And when I saw it, I happened to know the guy he interviewed, Professor Griff, who we tilted swords with, again, before you were born in 1989.
Wow.
And there he is, parroting again the same Farrakhanisms. And this guy, Nick Cannon, saying, oh, so you mean like, we're the real Hebrew, we're the real Jews? So when I saw that entire interview, I just wrote a quick tweet that said, if you want a PhD in hate, watch this program. Because It was in the context of what's called a Nick's Classroom, and it was under the sponsorship of Howard University in your hometown of Washington, known by many as the Harvard of African American community and academia. Well, Nick apparently saw my tweet from the Wiesenthal Center. He wanted to talk. We spoke on the phone. That led to his public apology to the Jewish community and a recognition that what he thought was fact was actually hateful propaganda, and then 2 face-to-face meetings, and so on and so forth. So when you can, the goal isn't just gotcha, right? Call it another anti-Semite. The goal is also to try to find ways to mitigate hate, to try to turn people in a different direction, to get them to embrace their better selves. This is, for your generation, for all of us, a very tough time. Being locked away because of the virus, being locked in to social media, meaning that every communication is now, its importance or alleged importance is heightened because we're sitting in front of the screen all day and all night. So this is a tough time. And the other part of my job is, since we have a wonderful, talented crew at the Museum of Tolerance, we train police, we do outreach to youth that are having problems, that we're also looking to create alliances, relationships, not just within the Jewish community, but I guess the term that's abused, it's called maybe tikkun olam. It's, one element about being a good Jew and a good person, but the idea is to find people of different faiths, different ethnicities and races and colors, and find common ground with them to do good, to do common good. And the other piece of that, because of the great name that the Museum of Tolerance has earned throughout the world, is that's opened doors for me from Indonesia to Azerbaijan, to Sudan, to the UAE, to Bahrain, to India. So it's been a wonderful, I would say sometimes exhilarating, always challenging, but a wonderful opportunity to help challenge people's stereotypes about Jews, because there are billions, with a B, billions of people out there who hear a lot about Jews and never going to meet one in their entire life. So whatever we can do to sort of knock down those stereotypes, I think that'd be very important. That's sort of, if you will, a pastime of mine. A lot of travel to Asia, and before the pandemic, by March 7th of this year, I already had 140,000 miles, but I haven't been on a plane since. One other thing to, when you ask what I do, so in February, just before the virus hit, I spent a number of days in Abuja, Nigeria, this capital of Nigeria, Africa's largest country. And unfortunately, a lot of Christians there are being targeted by terrorists, Islamic extremists. And myself and Pastor Johnny Moore, we debriefed about 90 of those survivors and their families, heartbreaking. And as a result, in October, we'll have a book that we both wrote about what's going on in Nigeria. And people might say, well, what's a rabbi doing talking about, blacks in Africa who are suffering a genocide? And I think the answer is, if you carry the name of Simon Wiesenthal and you see something like that happening, you have an obligation to speak out.
Yeah. So it's clear that anti-Semitism is a growing problem in the United States. So is anti-Semitism growing across the world at like the same rate? And if so, why do you think that's happening?
Well, anti-Semitism is history's oldest hate. And it's kind of like a cancer that metastasizes. It can go after you because you're a capitalist in one country, and then go after you in another country because you're a socialist. It could tell you, get out of Germany and go to Palestine, and then it'll say, get out of Palestine and go to Germany. Anti-Semitism is ever morphing, but today what we're looking at is, again, fueled by social media especially, fueled by a successful and ever-growing Jewish state of Israel, which has now well over 9 million citizens, among them over 7 million Jews, a powerhouse in the Middle East. So you have different sources. You have Nazis and neo-Nazis and white supremacists who are basically following the Hitler approach of racist anti-Semitism, violent anti-Semitism. You had two lone wolves attacking the synagogue in Pittsburgh and then the one in San Diego County. And then you have, flat out Nazis. We know what their ideology is. It's never going to change. At the other extreme, you have people like Linda Sarsour and others in the progressive wing of society, and basically saying is that everyone is allowed in, let's say, to the women's march against racism. But if you're a Zionist, you have to choose between being a Zionist and being on our side. That's a false choice. It's not true. There are many wonderful Jewish women and men who are progressives and also unabashed lovers and supporters of the state of Israel. But that's a source that also fuels the BDS boycott movement against the Jewish state. It's the movement that continually repeats the same lie over and over again, that Israel's an apartheid state, that it's a colonial, throwing whatever it can to demonize the Jewish people, but also to demonize Jewish students on their campuses, even in high school and universities, for having the audacity to stand up as proud Zionists. So you have from the far right, and you have from the far left. And then the third area, the big one, the big swamp, is from within the Muslim world, which you have theological extremism that initially targeted Israel, but now expands to really target all Jews and Judaism. We're not the real Jews. It's not the real Torah. We're a bunch of fakes. And it is extremely hateful. And that comes from three main sources. One, Saudi Arabia, which pays for the education of many imams around the world, and then places them in positions of responsibility around the world. Number two, Iran. The Ayatollah is a vicious Jew hater and Holocaust denier and wants to do away with Israel. And three, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is based in Egypt, and for a while whose leader was the head of Egypt. It also created Hamas. So their hatred for Israel, Jewish state, is genocidal. They want to kill us all. Insofar as the Ayatollah is concerned, again, extreme ideology. He says he's not against Jews, only Zionists, which is, of course, the overwhelming majority of Jews around the world. Now, Saudi Arabia, under the Crown Prince, has begun to turn that ship around. They seem to be going in the right direction, and if we can dry up the hatred that lasts for generations, because if you teach the teachers and they spread it, it's very hard to get people to turn away from that. And that leaves us Iran. If the Iranian regime hopefully will be replaced someday, and you won't have a state devoted to anti-Semitism, that will help. And then, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood is another major source. Here in the United States, again, social media is the delivery system, and unfortunately, in terms of African Americans, especially many young African Americans, they don't seem to really relate very much anymore to the message of a colorblind society of Martin Luther King Jr. as a vision, as a goal, and land up repeating a lot of the hateful, demonizing slanders against the Jewish people, including some important and wildly popular cultural figures among African Americans. So we have our work cut out for us. That means you guys have your work, and gals have your work cut out for you, the younger generation. I would just say the most important element of all, for younger people especially, is use the time to absorb and learn about and embrace the Jewish values that got us here. You'll find we live in a world now in which I think the most powerful motivator of most people around the world about Jews is not hatred, it's curiosity. So they got a million questions, like, why does a kid in Washington, D.C. care about what happens to a girl in Haifa, Israel? What's the connection? So the more your generation knows, the more it can experience the wonderful aspects of Judaism, and hopefully after this pandemic, get back to visiting Israel and making it a part of your life. The better positioned you will be to knock down the anti-Semites, but more importantly, forget about them. To be able to communicate with your neighbors, your fellow classmates, and explain to them why you're proud to be a proud Jew and a proud Zionist and a proud American. Now, they can take it or leave it, but they'll walk away respecting you. If you don't stand up for your rights, there is a whole lot of enemies out there that want to grind us to dust. And America is still the greatest democracy. So if we let that happen, it's our own fault.
And how important is it to support Israel and have them be strong in the fight against anti-Semitism?
Well, some people might say, Israel's a real pain in the neck because it's always seemed to be in the news and it's always controversy, and the Palestinians said they stole the land and all the rest of that stuff. But the truth of the matter is that the reason why we count for something is because Israel counts for something. The fact that for the first time in 2,000 years, the majority, the single largest Jewish community in the world is in the Holy Land, in the land of Israel. You have the startup nation, you have amazing biomedical and other high-tech advances that are just breathtaking. And we now see with the peace with the UAE and soon with other Arab countries, only good will come from peace. But in the meantime, in order to achieve the peace, Israel has to be the strongest one on the block. has to be the strongest one in the neighborhood. It has to be able to develop technologies that will knock out any ballistic missile, God forbid, sent from the Iranians. So it's an extremely dynamic place. Like many other places in the Middle East, it's a young country again. You know, it's your generation and beyond that's going to have the opportunity finally, we hope, to move forward with neighbors, whatever their religion might be, and build a better world for all. As far as the Jewish people in the state of Israel, well, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, and their great-grandparents prayed 3 times a day, sang on the Sabbath of return to Zion, of a hope that someday, after 2,000 years, the Jewish people somehow would reconnect, that would rediscover its language and its values and its land. And sure enough, here you are in 2020, and it's almost within our reach as soon as they allow us to fly again. So I think I think that every Jew should develop their own relationship and love for the land, no matter where they live. And at the same time, it also means that the Jewish people in Israel, which is a democracy, recognize that there's another people living in the same zip code or an adjacent one, and to try to find a way that the two people can live together in peace and mutual respect. Right now, unfortunately, the Palestinian Authority, not to even speak of genocidal Hamas, that's not what they're teaching their kids. Tragically, they're teaching their kids to embrace violence, to hold up terrorists as heroes, etc. But the most important thing Israelis are doing is sending a message every day. We're not going anywhere because we're home. And if you want to live in peace, we'll figure it out together. And if you don't want to live in peace, then we'll figure it out alone. And that's really the decision that Palestinians have to make for themselves. And all the rest of the stuff that you hear on campus and the BDS campaigns and the attacks on the Zionism is a bunch of racists and hoodlums. It's all there in order to single out and deny the Jewish people the same right that every other nation in the world has to pursue, its destiny and